Sometimes the loneliest doors are the ones miracles knock on first. Daniel Brooks had not turned on the porch light in 3 weeks. There did not seem much point anymore. Snow covered nearly everything outside his small cabin in northern Montana, swallowing the old gravel road, the rusted mailbox leaning sideways near the trees, even the worn tire tracks from the pickup truck he barely drove anymore. Winter had a strange way of making forgotten places disappear, and Daniel had spent the better part of 2 years quietly trying to disappear with them. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a frozen valley nearly 15 miles from town, tucked between pine trees heavy with snow and silence. Most people in Pine Hollow probably assumed the old Navy SEAL had finally moved away. Truth was, most people stopped asking about Daniel long before he stopped answering. At 58, his body no longer listened the way it once had. Years of hard deployments, damaged joints, cold weather injuries, and a chronic illness he rarely talked about had slowly turned ordinary things into battles nobody could see. Walking across the cabin on bad mornings felt harder than carrying military gear through mountains ever had. Some days he barely left the old leather chair beside the wood stove. Other days he sat for hours staring out the frosted window while untouched mail stacked near the front door. Hospital reminders, medical bills, letters he no longer opened. Somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped believing the world would notice if he simply faded into it. That Thursday night, wind rattled softly against the cabin walls while snow drifted sideways through the darkness outside. A storm warning played quietly from the old radio near the kitchen sink, though Daniel had stopped listening nearly an hour earlier. He sat wrapped in an old army blanket near the stove, though the heat barely touched the ache buried deep inside his bones. A half-finished bowl of canned soup rested untouched beside him. He had not been hungry much lately. The doctor from town called twice that week asking him to come in. Daniel ignored both calls. What difference would another appointment make? Sometimes exhaustion settled so deeply inside a person that hope itself started feeling heavier than sadness. Outside, snow continued falling hard beneath a sky swallowed completely by winter clouds. Daniel pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe tomorrow he would try harder. Maybe not. Truthfully, he was too tired to decide anymore. Then came the sound. Soft at first, easy to mistake for wind brushing against old wood. Scratch. Scratch. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. Silence returned. He frowned slightly and shifted in the chair. Probably branches again. The storm had been rough for hours. Scratch. This time louder. Closer. Near the front door. Daniel stayed still for several seconds. Nobody came this far up the mountain during weather like this. Delivery drivers barely visited during summer. Neighbors did not exist for miles. He stood carefully, wincing slightly as pain moved through his knees. The old floor creaked beneath slow steps while cold air slipped through tiny cracks near the cabin windows. Another sound came, not scratching this time, more like something weak brushing softly against the door. Daniel frowned deeper. Who was out there? He asked quietly, though the wind swallowed his voice. No answer. Just snow. Just silence. Still, something about the sound unsettled him. Not dangerous exactly. Sad somehow. Like something outside had already lost more than it could carry. Daniel reached the door and rested one tired hand against the lock. Cold pressed through the wood from outside. For a second, he almost turned away. Let winter keep whatever belonged to it tonight. But old habits stayed with good men longer than pain did. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. Wind rushed inside immediately, sharp and freezing. Snow blew across the floorboards. And there, curled tightly against the porch beneath a layer of frost and ice, lay a German shepherd nearly frozen from the cold. The dog barely lifted its head, black and tan fur stiff with snow, thin ribs visible beneath matted coat, one ear bent slightly downward, amber eyes tired but strangely steady. The animal did not bark, did not growl, only looked at Daniel quietly like it had finally found the place it had been searching for. Daniel stood frozen for a moment himself. Well, he muttered softly, voice rough with disbelief. You picked a bad house to show up at. The dog lowered its head weakly again, shivering so hard its body trembled against the frozen porch boards. Daniel exhaled slowly. Something old and familiar stirred inside him then. Not happiness exactly. Responsibility maybe. The kind men carried even after life tried teaching them not to care anymore. He crouched carefully despite aching joints. "Come on," he said quietly. "You are not staying out here." For a second, the dog did not move. Then slowly, painfully, it stood, weak legs shaking beneath exhaustion. Daniel held the door open wider and stepped back. The German shepherd entered cautiously, dripping melting snow onto worn wooden floors before stopping just inside the warmth of the cabin. But instead of settling down near the stove like any freezing animal should, the dog turned immediately toward the dark forest outside, stared into the storm, completely still, as if something out there still mattered more than survival. Daniel followed the animal's gaze into the endless white darkness beyond the porch. "What are you looking at?" he asked quietly. The dog did not blink, did not move, only stood facing the woods as snow continued falling hard beyond the cabin door. The German shepherd stood motionless near the door, staring into the snow-covered darkness, as if the storm itself had unfinished business. Daniel Brooks closed the cabin door slowly behind him, cutting off the sharp wind, but the dog barely reacted. Warm air from the wood stove drifted softly across the room, while melting snow pooled beneath tired paws. Still, the animal did not move toward the heat. It only watched the forest. Daniel rubbed one hand against his face and coughed quietly into his sleeve. "You are either stubborn," he muttered, "or waiting for something." The dog finally turned its head slightly. Amber eyes settled on him for a brief moment before shifting back toward the window. Something about that look unsettled Daniel. Not fear. Recognition, maybe. Like the dog expected something from him without asking for it. He sighed and moved slowly toward the kitchen counter. An old towel hung near the sink. He grabbed it, crouched carefully beside the animal, and paused. "All right," he said softly. "Let us at least get you warm." The German shepherd hesitated but did not resist. Daniel dried thick patches of frozen fur while chunks of packed snow fell onto the floorboards. Beneath the cold and exhaustion, the dog looked older than he first thought. Strong frame, scars hidden beneath fur, one ear slightly bent. Not wild, not abandoned long. There was discipline in the way it stayed still. Military almost. Daniel frowned slightly at the thought. "Someone trained you," he said quietly. "You do not survive weather like this by accident." He checked the old collar. Cracked leather. Worn metal ring. No tag. No phone number. Nothing except faded scratches where something once had been attached. The dog remained silent. No growling. No nervous pacing. Just quiet patience. Daniel reached for an old blanket from the couch and laid it near the stove. "There," he said. "Closest thing to luxury around here." For a second, he thought the animal might finally lie down. Instead, the German shepherd stood and walked slowly toward the front door again. Sat down beside it. Watching. Waiting. Daniel frowned deeper. Outside, wind howled softly through pine trees while snow drifted across the porch. Whatever the dog thought remained out there clearly mattered. But not tonight. Nobody survived mountain weather this brutal after dark. Not willingly. Daniel opened an old cabinet and found half a can of beef stew. He heated it quietly on the stove while the cabin filled with faint warmth and the smell of broth. He added leftover water into a metal bowl and set both near the dog. "Not exactly five-star dining," he said, "but it beats freezing." The dog finally moved. Slowly, carefully. It drank first. Long, thirsty pauses between breaths. Then ate without rushing. Almost politely, like an animal taught patience instead of desperation. Daniel sat back in the chair near the stove, exhaustion pressing against him harder now that he was no longer alone. Funny thing about silence. It felt heavier when someone else shared it. For weeks the cabin had only carried the sound of wind and old floorboards settling. Now came soft breathing, the occasional clink of a bowl, quiet life returning to empty corners. Daniel leaned back carefully, pain settling into his shoulders. "You know," he said after a while, voice rough with tiredness, "I was not really expecting company." The German shepherd lifted its head briefly, watched him, then returned to staring toward the door. Like somewhere beyond the snow, something unfinished still waited. Hours passed quietly. The storm worsened outside. Thick snow pressed against windows while moonlight disappeared completely behind clouds. Daniel nearly drifted asleep in the chair when sudden movement startled him awake. The dog stood immediately, alert, ears raised high, staring toward the door again. Not barking, just listening. Daniel followed the movement. "What now?" he asked quietly. The dog stepped closer to the entrance, waited, then looked back at Daniel. Once, purposefully. Daniel frowned. You want outside? The German shepherd walked closer again, tail still, eyes focused, then back toward the door. Daniel stood slowly, knees aching beneath stiff movement. You picked the wrong night for sightseeing. Still, something about the dog made him hesitate. It was not panic, not restlessness, more like certainty, the kind soldiers recognized in dangerous places. Quiet confidence before action. Daniel cracked the front curtain open slightly. Endless white snow, pine trees swaying beneath hard wind. Nothing visible except darkness. Yet somehow the dog remained fixed on the woods, as if it knew exactly where to look. Daniel closed the curtain again. Nobody is going anywhere tonight, he said firmly. You hear me? The dog sat down again, but kept watching, waiting. Daniel exhaled slowly and grabbed another log for the stove. Firelight flickered warmly across cabin walls while cold crept against the windows. Somewhere in the middle of the quiet, something strange happened. For the first time in months, Daniel noticed he had made it through an entire evening without thinking about disappearing. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe distraction, or maybe loneliness simply stepped back when another living thing sat nearby. Before turning off the lamp near his chair, Daniel looked toward the dog one more time. Guess you were staying, he said quietly. At least until this storm breaks. The German shepherd finally moved away from the door, slowly circling once before settling onto the old blanket near the stove. But even as its tired body relaxed, its eyes remained open, watching, listening, waiting for morning. And before sleep finally reached him, Daniel could not shake one strange thought from his mind. It did not feel like the dog had found the cabin by accident. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable stories ahead. Just before midnight, Daniel woke briefly to the sound of soft movement. The German shepherd stood again by the front window, staring into the storm as if morning could not come fast enough. Morning arrived slowly across the Montana Valley, pale light slipping through snow-covered pine trees like the world itself had not fully decided to wake up yet. Daniel Brooks opened his eyes to the familiar ache buried deep inside his shoulders and lower back, though something immediately felt different. The cabin no longer sounded empty. Soft breathing came from somewhere near the stove. For a brief second, he forgot about the dog entirely. Then memory returned. The freezing German shepherd, the strange eyes, the way it watched the forest like unfinished business waited out there in the snow. Daniel pushed himself carefully upright beneath the old blanket and glanced across the room. The dog was already awake, sitting near the front window again, alert, watching. Morning sunlight reflected softly against black and tan fur while snow drifted outside beneath a gray sky. The animal had barely moved from its silent post. You really do not quit, do you? Daniel muttered quietly. The German shepherd turned slightly at the sound of his voice. Calm, focused, then immediately looked back toward the woods. Daniel stood slowly, knees protesting the movement. The cabin felt colder than usual despite the fire still glowing faintly inside the stove. Overnight snow buried half the porch and swallowed most of the path leading toward the road. Storms like this usually kept people trapped indoors for days. Yet somehow the dog still carried the same quiet urgency. Daniel moved toward the kitchen and heated water for coffee. Habit mattered, even when hope did not. The old metal kettle rattled softly while pale steam filled the room. Outside, silence stretched endlessly across frozen hills. No trucks, no voices, only snow and pine trees. He poured coffee into the same chipped mug he had used for nearly 10 years and looked toward the dog again. You got a name? He asked quietly. No answer, of course. The dog simply blinked once. Watching him carefully now, Daniel studied the animal more closely in morning light. Strong frame despite exhaustion. Intelligent eyes. Disciplined posture. Even sitting still, the dog carried itself differently. Like something trained. Familiar. Daniel knew military dogs. Knew the look of patience mixed with purpose. You military? He asked softly, almost joking. One ear lifted slightly. Daniel almost smiled. Figures, he muttered. He reached into an old drawer for canned food and filled another bowl with leftover beef and rice. The German shepherd ate again, but slower now. More relaxed. Still, every few moments, it glanced toward the front door. Waiting. Daniel noticed something then. Near the collar, half hidden beneath thick fur, a tiny piece of worn metal caught sunlight. Curious, he crouched carefully. Hold still, he said quietly. The dog hesitated but allowed him closer. Daniel brushed fur aside gently. A faded engraving, barely readable beneath scratches and weather damage. One word remained visible. Shadow. Daniel stared for a moment. Shadow, he repeated softly. The dog lifted its head immediately. Small movement, almost too quick to miss. Recognition. Daniel leaned back slowly. Guess that settles it. Shadow stood before the door again, waiting, watching. Then something changed. The dog walked directly to Daniel. Stopped. Looked at him. Then at the door. Then back again. Once. Twice. Purposeful. Daniel frowned. You want out. Shadow moved closer to the entrance immediately. Tail still. Eyes focused. Waiting. Daniel glanced outside through the window. Snow still thick, but manageable. Wind calmer now. Dangerous weather, but survivable. You have got somewhere to be, he said quietly. Shadow pawed lightly at the floor. Not frantic. Certain. Daniel hesitated. Every part of him wanted to stay inside. Warm fire. Quiet isolation. Same routine. Same disappearing act he had perfected over 2 long winters. Yet something strange stirred beneath his exhaustion. Curiosity maybe. Or responsibility. Old instincts veterans never fully lost. He grabbed his heavy coat hanging near the door. Thick gloves. Wool hat. Boots still damp from days earlier. Shadow stood straighter immediately. Watching. Waiting. I am already regretting this, Daniel muttered under his breath. But for the first time in months, he found himself preparing to leave the cabin for reasons that had nothing to do with groceries or medicine. Outside, cold air bit hard against his face the moment he opened the door. Snow reached nearly 8 inches deep across the porch. Pine trees bent beneath fresh white weight, while distant hills disappeared behind soft gray clouds. Shadow stepped outside first without hesitation, then paused, turned back, watching Daniel carefully as though making sure he followed. You really think I am coming? Daniel asked. Shadow walked several feet into the snow before stopping again. Looking back, waiting, Daniel sighed deeply and stepped off the porch, boots crunching softly against frozen ground. The old ache in his joints followed immediately, though strangely it felt quieter today, less sharp somehow. Shadow began moving toward the tree line bordering the property, slow enough for Daniel to keep pace, never too far ahead, like someone leading instead of wandering. About 15 minutes later, they reached something Daniel had not expected. Tracks, fresh footprints pressed into snow deeper inside the woods. Human. Not old either. Maybe 1 day. 2 at most. Daniel frowned immediately. Nobody came this far into the valley during storms. Nobody except hunters, lost hikers, or people with reasons not to be found. Shadow stood still beside the trail, watching him carefully again, waiting for a decision. Daniel looked deeper into the woods where pine trees swallowed sunlight whole, then back toward the warm cabin barely visible in the distance. Something about this no longer felt accidental. Shadow had not simply wandered onto his porch. The dog had come looking for something, or someone, and somehow, Daniel could not shake the feeling that this trail had been waiting for him long before the storm ever arrived. The footprints disappeared and reappeared beneath drifting snow, leading deeper into the forest where sunlight barely reached the frozen ground. Daniel Brooks stood motionless for a moment, cold air settling heavily in his lungs while Shadow waited several feet ahead, patient but unmoving, like the next step belonged entirely to Daniel. Wind moved softly through pine branches overhead, shaking loose small patches of snow that drifted quietly toward the earth below. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once before silence returned. The kind of silence mountains carried when they were keeping secrets. Daniel adjusted the collar of his old winter coat and looked back once toward the direction of his cabin, now barely visible between tall trees and blowing snow. Warm fire, coffee, familiar loneliness. Safe. Yet something about turning back suddenly felt harder than following forward. Shadow glanced at him again. Waiting. All right, Daniel muttered quietly. Lead the way. The German shepherd moved immediately. Not running. Not wandering. Purposeful. Slow enough for Daniel to follow through snow nearly reaching mid-calf in deeper places. Every few minutes the dog stopped briefly, checking behind to make sure Daniel still followed. Almost protective. Almost practiced. The trail curved north through dense pine woods Daniel barely recognized despite living nearby for years. Strange how isolation made people stop noticing the world around them. 2 winters of surviving had slowly turned into 2 winters of hiding. Daniel realized he had not walked these woods in longer than he cared to admit. After nearly 30 minutes, the forest changed. Trees thinned. Wind moved easier across an open stretch where snow covered what looked like an old service path forgotten by time. Shadows slowed near a fallen wooden sign buried halfway beneath ice. Daniel brushed snow away carefully. The faded lettering barely remained visible. Ash Creek Road. Closed. He frowned slightly. Nobody uses this anymore, he said softly. Shadow kept moving. Another 10 minutes passed before Daniel saw it. Small at first, almost swallowed by forest. A shape hidden beneath snow and silence. Cabin. Old. Forgotten. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. One side of the roof sagged slightly beneath heavy snow while frost clung to darkened windows. Pine branches leaned protectively across part of the structure as if nature itself had tried to hide it. Daniel slowed immediately. Something about the place unsettled him. Not dangerous exactly. Sad. Like someone had stopped living there without ever fully leaving. Shadow moved toward the porch with sudden urgency. Tail low. Focus sharp. Daniel followed slowly. Old wooden steps creaked beneath snow. The front door stood slightly crooked, weathered by years of mountain winters. Near the entrance sat an overturned metal bucket frozen in place. Beside it, boot prints almost completely buried beneath snow. Old, but not ancient. Maybe weeks. Daniel crouched carefully near the porch. Human tracks once. More than one trip back and forth. Then suddenly nothing. Storms had erased the rest. Shadow stood beside the door now. Waiting. Daniel frowned. You know this place. It was not a question anymore. The dog pawed gently near the wood once, then looked directly at him. Daniel hesitated. Old instincts stirred quietly beneath exhaustion. The same feeling military operations once gave him. Something important hidden behind silence. He tested the handle slowly. Locked. But mountain locks rarely held forever against weather. One nearby window looked cracked enough to peek through. Frost covered most of the glass, though Daniel cleared a patch carefully with his glove. Inside sat shadows and dust. A small table. Old wood stove. Shelves. Blankets folded neatly near the wall. Yet something felt wrong. The place looked lived in. Recently. Not abandoned years ago. Like someone walked away expecting to return tomorrow. Daniel stepped back slowly. Who lived here? He whispered to himself. Shadow moved suddenly toward the backside of the cabin. Daniel followed around frozen bushes and snow-covered logs. Behind the structure sat a stack of chopped firewood half-covered beneath tarp. 2 organized for abandonment. Nearby rested an old metal water container only lightly frosted. Used recently. Daniel felt something shift quietly inside him then. Concern maybe. Nobody survived mountain winters alone without preparation. Whoever stayed here had known what they were doing. Which meant something happened. Shadow stopped near the back door. Sat down. Waiting again. Daniel noticed something hanging just inside the frost-covered back window. A photograph frame tilted sideways against the wall. Hard to see clearly. He moved closer, wiping snow away from the glass. Then froze. The photograph showed an older man standing outside this exact cabin wearing an old military jacket. Beside him sat a younger German shepherd. Same bent ear. Same alert eyes. Same posture. Shadow. Daniel stared silently for several seconds. No way, he muttered under his breath. He leaned closer. Something else caught his attention. A military insignia hanging on the cabin wall beside the photograph. Familiar. Too familiar. Navy SEAL trident. Daniel stepped back slowly, pulse suddenly sharper beneath the cold. Whoever lived here had been military. Maybe Navy. Maybe more. Shadow stood quietly beside him now, watching not the cabin, but Daniel himself. Like it had been waiting for him to see this. Wind moved gently between trees while snow drifted silently through pale mountain light. Then Daniel noticed something else. Beneath the back porch, half hidden by snow near stacked wood, fresh disturbance in the ground. Like something had recently been dug up. Or buried. Shadow walked toward it immediately and stopped. Waiting. Daniel Brooks stood frozen beside the back porch while cold wind drifted softly between pine trees overhead. Snow crunched quietly beneath worn boots as Shadow waited beside the disturbed patch of frozen ground, unmoving, patient, almost certain. The German shepherd did not bark or paw frantically. He simply stood there watching Daniel with calm expectation, as though this moment mattered more than anything that had happened since arriving at the cabin door the night before. Daniel pulled one glove tighter and crouched carefully despite the ache running through his knees. The disturbed snow looked recent. Not fresh from hours ago, but recent enough that winter had not fully erased the edges. Someone had dug here, or uncovered something. What exactly are you trying to show me? He muttered quietly. Shadow lowered his head once toward the spot. Daniel exhaled slowly. Every reasonable part of him said to leave. Call county services. Let someone else deal with strange cabins and missing strangers. But another part of him, the older part he thought had gone quiet years ago, recognized something familiar. Missions never started with answers. They started with details that refused to make sense. He brushed snow aside with gloved hands until hard metal scraped softly beneath frozen dirt. Daniel frowned. Carefully, he pulled upward. A small weathered metal box emerged beneath packed snow, old but sealed tightly against moisture. Not large, maybe 12 inches wide, heavy enough to matter. Daniel sat back slowly, staring at it. Shadow lowered himself calmly beside him as though relieved they had finally arrived where they were supposed to be. You knew this was here, Daniel said quietly. The German shepherd only watched him. Snow drifted softly around them while silence settled across the mountain. Daniel hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside rested neatly stacked envelopes wrapped carefully in plastic. Old photographs, a small notebook, several documents clipped together, and beneath them all, an envelope with large, careful handwriting across the front. For whoever Shadow trusts. Daniel stared for several long seconds. Wind moved quietly through trees overhead. Somewhere distant, ice cracked faintly near the creek below, but everything else felt strangely still. He opened the envelope carefully. The handwriting inside looked steady despite age. If you are reading this, it means Shadow found someone worth bringing here. First, thank you for helping him. Second, I am sorry if this feels strange. Life became strange for me too. My name is Walter Hayes, former Navy SEAL. And if Shadow brought you here, there is a good chance you understand loneliness better than most people. Daniel blinked slowly. The words landed heavier than expected. He kept reading. I got older, sicker, quieter. The world forgets veterans faster than people admit, especially the ones who stop asking for help. So I started helping others instead, quietly, because lonely men understand lonely men. Daniel swallowed hard. Snow drifted softly against the edge of the porch roof while Shadow rested beside him, completely calm now. Inside the box sat folders labeled carefully with names and small notes beside each. Veterans living alone. Veterans needing groceries. Medical rides. Emergency heating funds. Local support contacts. Small handwritten reminders filled the pages. Mr. Evans refuses help unless someone pretends it is accidental. Martha lost her husband in Afghanistan. Call before holidays. Daniel stared quietly. Walter had been helping people. Not officially. Not publicly. Quietly. One person at a time. The kind of kindness nobody noticed because it asked for nothing back. Then Daniel noticed something strange. One folder sat near the bottom with no plastic cover. Just a name written neatly in black ink. Daniel Brooks. His hands froze instantly. For a second, he thought maybe exhaustion blurred his vision. But no. His name remained there. He opened it slowly. Inside sat handwritten notes dated over nearly a year. Daniel Brooks. Lives alone near Eastern Ridge. Former Navy SEAL. Chronic illness. Does not come into town much anymore. Refuses help politely. Check during winter if possible. Daniel stared motionless. A folded receipt slipped loose. Medication from the local pharmacy. Anonymous payment. Winter heating assistance quietly covered twice. Daniel frowned harder. The electric company warning letter he thought somehow disappeared last year suddenly returned to memory. The groceries once left mysteriously at his porch during bad weather. Things he stopped questioning because life felt easier when people did not ask questions. Walter had known about him, helped him, quietly, without introducing himself, without asking for thanks. Daniel leaned back against frozen wood, stunned silence settling deep inside him. I never even met him, he whispered softly. Shadow lifted his head. Calm amber eyes rested on Daniel like he already knew what came next. At the bottom of the folder sat one final envelope. Handwritten again. Smaller this time. Daniel opened it carefully. If Shadow found you, then maybe I ran out of time. Truth is, I wanted to visit. Veterans like us disappear easy. Hard to admit when we are not doing all right. Harder to ask for help. I figured maybe we could drink coffee sometime and complain about getting old. But if life moved faster than expected, maybe Shadow will finish what I started. Daniel looked toward the old cabin through drifting snow. Something heavy shifted quietly inside him then. Not sadness exactly. Something deeper. Recognition maybe. For years he believed nobody noticed him fading away. Yet somewhere nearby, another old veteran had been quietly keeping watch, helping from a distance, understanding without needing explanations. Shadow stood slowly then and walked toward the back cabin door again, waiting, watching, like somehow the real story had not even begun yet. Then Daniel noticed something resting half-buried beneath snow beside the doorway. A rusted key. Daniel Brooks stood silently beneath drifting snow while cold wind moved through pine branches overhead, carrying the quiet sound of winter settling across forgotten ground. The rusted key rested in his gloved hand, heavier than it should have felt. Shadow stood beside the cabin door watching him carefully, calm now, almost patient, as if this exact moment had been waiting to happen for a very long time. Daniel looked once more at the old photograph through the frost-covered window. Walter Hayes beside a younger Shadow. Same intelligent eyes. Same posture. Same quiet loyalty. The realization settled deeper now. Shadow had not wandered here by accident. The dog had returned. Returned for something unfinished. Returned for someone. Daniel glanced down at the key. You really brought me here for a reason, did you not? He asked quietly. Shadow blinked once, then turned toward the back door again. Daniel stepped closer, boots sinking softly into snow. The old lock looked weathered but intact. He hesitated for only a second before sliding the rusted key inside. Metal resisted at first, then slowly turned. A soft click echoed through the stillness. Strange how small sounds sometimes carried enormous weight. Daniel pushed the door open carefully. Cold air drifted outward carrying the faint scent of old cedar wood, with smoke long faded, and something else harder to describe. Memory maybe. The cabin stood frozen in time. Not abandoned exactly. Paused. A cast iron stove rested near the center of the room, surrounded by neatly stacked firewood. A heavy wool blanket draped carefully across an old chair. Books lined crooked shelves near one wall. Boots still sat near the entrance beside a worn winter coat, hanging patiently where someone left it. Daniel stepped inside slowly while floorboards creaked beneath tired weight. Shadow followed immediately, moving with quiet familiarity. Not nervous. Home. The German shepherd walked directly toward the far corner near the stove and lowered himself onto an old rug, finally resting in a way Daniel had not seen since the night before. No more watching the door. No more urgency. Just stillness. Daniel looked around carefully. Whoever Walter Hayes had been, he lived simply, thoughtfully. Coffee cups stacked neatly beside the sink. A small radio near the bookshelf. Framed photographs scattered across shelves. Most showed mountains, fishing trips, and aging veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling awkwardly beneath faded hats. One photograph caught Daniel's attention immediately. Walter stood beside 3 older veterans holding grocery bags near a church parking lot. Written beneath the frame in small handwriting, Tuesday deliveries. Nobody eats alone if I can help it. Daniel swallowed quietly. There it was again. Quiet kindness. No speeches. No praise. Just small steady acts nobody noticed. Near the kitchen table sat a notebook lying open. Daniel stepped closer. Pages filled with names. Addresses. Notes written carefully beside each entry. Mrs. Palmer, check furnace before January storm. Tom, arthritis getting worse, bring groceries Fridays. Veteran on East Ridge, still refuses rides to clinic, be patient. Daniel paused. Veteran on East Ridge. Him. Again. Walter had not forgotten. Walter had watched. Helped quietly while Daniel disappeared into himself. He lowered himself carefully into the nearest chair, body aching harder now from cold and distance. Snow pressed softly against windows while silence settled warmly inside the little cabin. Strange thing about loneliness. Sometimes it felt permanent until proof appeared that someone had seen it all along. Daniel opened another drawer near the table. Inside sat dozens of handwritten letters. Thank you notes mostly. Holiday cards. Photographs of children beside older veterans. One note read simply, "Thank you for helping my father when nobody else remembered him." Another said, "You probably saved his winter. God bless you." Daniel leaned back slowly, staring toward the ceiling beams overhead. "Who were you?" he whispered softly. Shadow lifted his head briefly from the rug, ears twitching at the sound of Daniel's voice. Then rested again, almost peaceful now, like he trusted the cabin to answer what words could not. Hours slipped quietly by without Daniel noticing. He fed extra wood into the old stove after finding dry kindling stacked neatly nearby. Warmth slowly returned to the cabin while pale afternoon sunlight drifted lower beyond frosted windows. For the first time in months, Daniel realized something strange. He had not thought about his illness once all day. Not the doctor. Not exhaustion. Not disappearing. Purpose had a strange way of interrupting sadness. Near sunset, Daniel noticed one final object resting carefully atop the fireplace mantel. A folded envelope with only 2 words written across the front in steady handwriting. For Daniel. His chest tightened immediately. "No," he whispered softly. "That is not possible." Shadow stood slowly then. Walked toward him. Sat quietly beside the fireplace. Waiting again. Watching. Like somehow Walter Hayes had known this moment would come long before either of them ever arrived. Daniel Brooks stared at the envelope resting above the fireplace while snow drifted quietly beyond frost-covered windows. For Daniel, the handwriting looked steady, familiar somehow despite belonging to someone he had never met. Shadow sat calmly nearby, amber eyes resting on him with the strange patience of someone who already knew how the story ended. The old cabin felt warmer now, firelight moving softly against cedar walls while winter settled heavily outside. Daniel reached slowly for the envelope, though something inside him hesitated. Strange thing about loneliness. After enough time, even kindness could feel unfamiliar. Carefully, he unfolded the letter. "Daniel, if Shadow trusted you enough to bring you here, then I probably already know something important about you. Men like us do not ask for help easily. We survive. We adapt. We disappear quietly before anyone notices we stopped showing up. I recognized that look in you long before we ever met." Daniel lowered the paper slightly. A cold feeling moved through his chest. Walter had seen him. Somehow. Not just the man driving through town once every few weeks for groceries. Not the veteran people nodded at politely before moving on. The tired version. The disappearing version. He continued reading. "I wanted to stop by more than once. But I figured pride gets heavy when pain stays too long. I learned that myself after service. So instead, I watched from a distance and helped where I could without embarrassing you. Heating bills, pharmacy costs, groceries once in a while. Veterans know when another veteran is fighting something they do not talk about." Daniel stared toward the fire quietly. Memory returned in small pieces now. The winter power bill that suddenly disappeared after he thought he would lose heat. Extra canned food left once near his porch during a snowstorm. Medication somehow covered when money ran short. He always assumed mistakes happened. Or luck. But luck rarely remembered details. Walter had remembered. The letter continued. "If you are reading this, then life probably moved faster than I hoped. Truth is, my health got worse this year. Shadow knew before I did. Dogs always know. I wanted to believe I had more time to keep helping people. Turns out life decides those things differently sometimes." Daniel swallowed slowly. Fire cracked softly nearby while wind moved gently outside. Shadow rested his head near Daniel's boot now, calmer than ever before. As if bringing him here had finally eased something inside him too. Near the bottom of the letter sat another folded page. A list. Names. Addresses. Notes beside each one. Veterans living alone across Pine Hollow and neighboring valleys. Some needed rides to appointments. Others food. Heating assistance. One older veteran simply had a note that read, "Mostly just lonely. Likes coffee." Daniel almost smiled despite himself. Walter had built something quiet here. Invisible kindness. One careful person at a time. At the bottom sat one final handwritten sentence. Somebody has to keep checking on them. "Maybe it is your turn now." Daniel leaned back slowly in the old chair. "My turn," he whispered under his breath. The words sounded impossible. He had barely managed to care for himself lately. Illness still followed him. Exhaustion remained close. Some mornings walking across his own cabin felt like work. Yet strangely, sitting inside Walter's cabin, something shifted in a way Daniel had not expected. Purpose. Small. Fragile. But real. Shadow lifted his head suddenly, and walked toward the front window. Watching snow fall quietly, Daniel looked toward him. "You knew all this, huh?" he asked softly. Shadow glanced back once. Calm, almost knowing. Daniel laughed quietly for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not loud, just enough to surprise himself. Evening settled slowly around the mountain. Instead of returning home immediately, Daniel stayed. He added wood to the fire. Heated soup he found stored carefully in the pantry. Cleaned dishes without really thinking about why. Strange how quickly a place stopped feeling abandoned once someone moved gently through it again. Before leaving, Daniel gathered several folders carefully into an old canvas bag. Names, addresses, notes Walter left unfinished. He did not know what he planned to do exactly, but something told him leaving them behind would feel wrong. Outside, snow finally slowed beneath a sky slowly clearing. Stars appeared between branches overhead, while cold air sharpened around the mountain. Daniel locked the cabin carefully behind him. Shadow stood waiting near the path back home. Calm now. No urgency. Just quiet patience. Halfway back through the woods, Daniel noticed something unexpected. His breathing felt easier somehow. Chest lighter. Not healed, but different. Like carrying purpose weighed less than carrying loneliness. By the time they reached the cabin near midnight, exhaustion finally caught him hard. Daniel barely managed to light the stove before settling heavily into the old chair. Shadow lay nearby immediately. Closed this time. No longer watching the door. No longer restless. Home, maybe. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, tired beyond words. Then came the cough. Harder than usual. Sharper. Pain pressed deep through his chest, stronger than before. He steadied himself against the chair and breathed slowly until it passed. Outside, wind moved softly through snow-covered trees. Inside, warmth settled across quiet walls. But somewhere beneath exhaustion, Daniel suddenly understood something uncomfortable. If he planned to finish what Walter started, hiding from his illness was no longer an option. And for the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something he might actually need to survive. Morning came slower than usual, pale sunlight slipping across frozen windows, while the mountain valley remained buried beneath fresh snow. Daniel Brooks woke in the chair beside the stove with stiffness settled deep into his shoulders and a heaviness in his chest that had not fully left since the night before. Shadow slept nearby on the old blanket, though one ear lifted the moment Daniel moved. The German shepherd opened his eyes immediately, alert without seeming restless now, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted after returning Daniel to the cabin. For several moments, neither moved. Firewood cracked softly inside the stove while cold winter light stretched quietly across worn wooden floors. Daniel rubbed tired hands across his face and coughed again, softer this time, but still enough to remind him something inside his body had not been right for a long while. He looked toward the canvas bag resting beside the kitchen table. Walter's folders. Names. Addresses. Lives quietly waiting for someone to notice them. Somehow, everything felt different now. For 2 years Daniel had survived one day at a time, barely thinking beyond weather forecasts and doctor appointments he often ignored. But now morning carried something unfamiliar. Obligation. Purpose. He stood slowly and filled Shadow's bowl with water and leftover food. "Guess we both survived the night," he muttered quietly. Shadow ate calmly before walking to the front door and sitting beside it, watching Daniel carefully. Not urgent. Just waiting. Daniel almost smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know. We have work to do." The nearest name on Walter's list belonged to a veteran named Harold Bennett. 81 years old. Lived alone, less than 12 miles from town. Note beside the address reads simply, "Struggles in winter." Pretends he is fine. Likes black coffee and old war movies. Daniel stared at the page longer than expected. Strange how one sentence could make a stranger feel familiar. By noon, snow eased enough to clear the road. Daniel packed extra canned goods from his own shelves, an old blanket, and firewood left over in the truck bed. Shadow climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. Quiet. Comfortable. Like he already understood the mission. The drive into Pine Hollow felt strange after weeks of isolation. Small shops lined Main Street beneath hanging icicles. Smoke drifted softly above rooftops while locals moved through cold air carrying groceries and winter coats. Daniel noticed something he had ignored for years. People looked tired too. Lonely too. Life had a way of hiding struggles behind ordinary faces. Harold's cabin sat near the edge of town, surrounded by snow-covered brush and a fence leaning slightly to one side. Smoke barely drifted from the chimney. Daniel knocked twice before the door opened slowly. An older man stood there wearing a heavy flannel shirt and suspicion across tired eyes. "Whatever you are selling," Harold muttered. "I already cannot afford it." Daniel hesitated awkwardly. Social things always felt harder than military operations somehow. "Not selling anything," he said quietly. "Just checking in." Harold frowned deeper. "Who sent you?" Daniel glanced toward Shadow waiting patiently near the truck. "A friend," he answered after a pause. Something softened slightly inside the old man's expression. 30 minutes later, coffee warmed quietly inside Harold's kitchen while an old movie played softly from a television near the corner. Shadow rested calmly near the stove while Harold talked more than Daniel expected. About military memories. About loneliness after losing his wife. About winter feeling longer every year. Before leaving, Daniel stacked firewood near the porch and quietly fixed a loose step near the entrance without mentioning it. Harold stood at the doorway afterward, shaking his head. "You know," he said quietly, "most folks stop showing up after people get old." Daniel looked toward the snow-covered road. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." On the drive home, exhaustion settled harder than before. Deep. Heavy. By sunset, Daniel barely made it inside the cabin before dizziness hit unexpectedly. Stronger this time. He steadied himself against the counter, breathing slower, waiting for the room to settle. Shadow stood immediately, watching closely now. Concerned, Daniel waved one tired hand. "I am all right," he muttered. But the truth felt harder to ignore. He was not all right. Not really. That night fever came quietly. Small at first, then heavier. Daniel drifted between shallow sleep and exhaustion near the stove while snow moved softly outside beneath moonlight. Sometime after midnight, he woke coughing harder than before, chest tight enough to scare him for the first time in months. Shadow stood instantly, ears alert, watching him carefully. Daniel tried standing for water, but dizziness caught him halfway across the room. He lowered himself heavily back into the chair, breathing slowly. "Just need sleep," he whispered, though even he did not believe it. Shadow remained beside him for several minutes. Then suddenly something strange happened. The German shepherd moved toward the door. "Waiting." Daniel frowned weakly. "Not tonight," he said quietly. Shadow did not move, just stood there watching him, then pawed softly at the door once. Daniel shook his head tiredly. "Stay inside." But sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep. And when Daniel woke hours later beneath pale morning light, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. He looked toward the blanket near the stove. Empty. The front door sat slightly cracked open. Snow drifted softly across the porch. Shadow was gone. Daniel Brooks pushed himself upright too quickly, dizziness catching him hard enough that he had to grab the edge of the table to steady himself. Cold morning light stretched quietly across the cabin floor, while snow drifted softly through the partly opened front door. Shadow was gone. The old blanket near the stove sat empty. Water untouched. Silence pressed strangely against the walls. "Shadow," Daniel called hoarsely, though even speaking felt heavier than it should. No answer came except distant wind brushing through pine trees outside. He moved carefully toward the door, chest still tight from fever and exhaustion. Fresh paw prints disappeared down the porch steps and toward the road. Purposeful. Fast. Daniel frowned weakly. "Where did you go?" he whispered. Part of him worried immediately. Another strange part did not. Something about Shadow never felt reckless. The dog moved with intention. Like every decision carried meaning. Daniel closed the door against the cold and lowered himself slowly into the chair again. Fever still sat heavily behind his eyes. Maybe he needed medicine. Maybe rest. Maybe finally admitting he could not keep pretending things would somehow improve on their own. Hours passed slowly. Snow softened beneath weak sunlight, while Daniel drifted between sleep and waking beside the stove. Sometime near noon came the sound. Tires crunching across frozen gravel outside. Then hurried footsteps. Voices. Daniel opened tired eyes just as someone knocked quickly against the door. Before he could answer, it opened. Shadow stepped inside first. Calm. Focused. Snow clung lightly to his fur, though his eyes looked brighter somehow. Behind him stood a woman bundled in a winter coat carrying a medical bag. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Daniel Brooks?" she asked gently. I am Dr. Emily Carter. I think your dog just recruited me. Daniel stared speechless. Shadow walked calmly to the stove and lay down like nothing unusual had happened at all. Emily removed her gloves, kneeling beside Daniel carefully. Harold Bennett called town this morning. She explained while checking his pulse. Said you had been helping him yesterday. Then your dog showed up outside my clinic acting like the world was ending. She smiled faintly toward Shadow. Honestly, I followed him because he refused to leave. Daniel looked toward the German shepherd in disbelief. You went for help? He muttered softly. Shadow rested his head quietly between his paws. Emily checked his temperature, breathing, and lungs carefully while concern settled across her face. Daniel, she said gently after several minutes. This should have been treated weeks ago. Maybe months. He sighed tiredly. Been busy disappearing. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Emily paused briefly. Not judging. Just listening. Well, she said quietly. Looks like somebody decided that plan was canceled. She glanced toward Shadow again. Daniel followed her gaze. Strange thing about loneliness. Sometimes it convinced people they mattered less than they actually did. Yet somehow a freezing dog had crossed mountains to find him, then crossed them again to save him. Emily stayed several hours. Medication, fluids, instructions he knew he probably should have followed sooner. Before leaving, she stood near the doorway adjusting her coat. You know, she said softly, town remembers veterans more than you think. They just stop knocking when doors stay closed too long. Daniel looked toward the window where afternoon light rested quietly across snow-covered hills. Maybe I stopped opening them, he admitted. Emily smiled faintly. Then maybe start again. After she left, silence returned to the cabin. But not the old silence. Different somehow. Softer. Warmer. Shadow rested near the stove, finally peaceful. No watching the door anymore. No restless waiting. Daniel sat quietly for a long time before finally reaching toward the canvas bag Walter left behind. Folders. Names. Lives quietly waiting. Slowly, he pulled out a notebook and began writing. Heating deliveries. Grocery checks. Doctor appointments. Veterans to visit. One small step at a time. Winter stretched onward for several weeks, though life no longer felt frozen. Daniel repaired Walter's cabin little by little. Delivered firewood. Shared coffee. Fixed broken steps. Drove older veterans to appointments. Sometimes people talked. Sometimes they simply sat quietly beside him. Funny thing about healing. It often arrived quietly disguised as purpose. By spring, snow melted slowly across the valley while pine trees carried hints of green again. Walter's cabin no longer looked abandoned. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney most mornings. Veterans stopped by for coffee. Harold came twice a week pretending he only liked the free pie. Emily checked on Daniel often, though eventually those visits felt less like appointments and more like friendship. One warm afternoon, Daniel sat outside Walter's old cabin while sunlight stretched softly across the valley below. Shadow rested nearby beneath the porch steps, older now somehow, but calmer than ever. Daniel unfolded Walter's final letter one more time. At the bottom, beneath words he nearly memorized already, sat one sentence he somehow overlooked before. Sometimes help arrives cold, tired, and covered in snow. When it does, open the door anyway. Daniel smiled quietly and looked toward Shadow. Guess you found the right house after all, he said softly. Shadow lifted his head briefly, tail moving once against warm spring dirt before resting again beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted from inside the cabin while coffee brewed softly in the kitchen. Life moved quietly forward. Not perfect, not painless, but no longer lonely. And for the first time in years, Daniel no longer wanted to disappear. Sometimes miracles did not arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrived with tired eyes, frozen paws, and a quiet refusal to let someone be forgotten.